These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. Black to move. What is the best move? Here is another more complicated sequence. It will take a bit of patience to untangle. Black's knight is on a dark square in white's territory. Also on dark squares are all of white's most valuable pieces: king, queen, and both rooks. Start by just looking at each of the knight's moves in search of potential forks. There are two: knight moves to e2, check, forking white's king, queen, and rook, and knight moves to d3, attacking both rooks. Now carefully identify what prevents either of those two moves. Knight moves to e2, check, is stopped by one thing, the rook at e1 that protects the square. Knight moves to d3 is stopped by two things, the knight at f2 and queen at g3 that both protect the square. Take stock next of what resources black can bring to bear against those guardians. White's queen can be taken by black's queen. As for the knight at f2 and the rook at e1, neither of them can be captured by black. So next consider whether they are guarding anything black can attack, and they are. They both protect the knight at e4. Can black attack that knight? Yes, twice, with the bishop at f5 and the queen behind it. Now begin thinking about possible move orders and their consequences, always bearing in mind that you are hoping to free up either d3 or e2 for your knight. Try bishop takes knight. How will white respond? There are two possibilities if he chooses to recapture: knight takes bishop or rook takes bishop. If knight takes bishop, then one of the two guardians of d3 has been eliminated, only the queen remains, and it can then be taken with queen takes queen. After white then plays pawn from h2 takes queen, black can play knight moves to d3, forking the rooks. If white instead plays rook takes bishop, the rook still guards e2. But black can attack it again. Remember that when two pieces are lined up like the queen and bishop here, they attack e4 twice. So black plays queen takes rook, and after white replies with knight takes queen, the e2 square is available for knight moves to e2, check, forking white's king and queen. The conclusion: black wins by starting with bishop takes knight, because any recapture white makes in response leads to a knight fork for black. This position is tricky because black has two offensive options and white has choices to make as well in response to bishop takes knight. But a methodical examination of black's goals, the impediments to them, and white's possible replies to black's captures nevertheless breaks it all down easily enough. White to move. What is the best move? Black's knight on d4 is creating a great deal of trouble. It's about to take white's queen and also threatens a fork at e2. The natural idea is to take the knight, but with your bishop or with your own knight. Consider what else you can do with either of them. White's knight is on a light square, and so are black's queen and rook, and his king, but for now only the queen and rook are within range. White would like to play the fork knight takes at e5, but now he can't. The problem isn't the pawn on e5, it's the pawn on f6 that guards e5. White has no other pieces he can use to capture either pawn, but the more natural way to get rid of troublesome pawns is to capture things they protect, for then they move to recapture and no longer guard the squares they once did. So white breaks the logjam with bishop takes knight, forcing black to recapture with pawn from e5 takes bishop. Now the path is clear for white to play pawn from e4 moves to e5, still in an effort to get the f6 pawn to move. Black has to play pawn from f6 takes at e5, if he instead moves his knight away from d6, white pushes the pawn to e6 and forks the rook and queen with cover from his own queen at b3. At last nothing guards e5, so white can play knight takes at e5, forking queen and rook and winning the exchange. Observe how the whole sequence was driven by an idea: if the f6 pawn could be lured off of guard duty of e5, the fork would be possible, so white works on ways to attract it away with captures and threats. White to move. What is the best move? Here is the same position, still one move earlier. The train of thought starts the same, but here there is no way to get the e5 pawn off of its square by attacking something it protects, for it protects nothing. Observe the difficulty of forcing an enemy pawn to move when it protects nothing that you can capture. Don't give up, though. Can you play a forcing move that will cause one of the pawns to then protect something else, creating a way to break the jam? If white somehow could force a black piece onto d4, then he could take it with his bishop, initiating the sequence described a moment ago. So he experiments with threats: pawn from a2 moves to a4 forces the knight to move, and to where? A knight has a maximum of 8 places it can move when attacked, and when it's near the side of the board the number is smaller. Here there are just 6 squares it can reach, and only one that is available and doesn't result in immediate capture. Black plays knight moves to d4. And now the stage is set for the sequence examined in the previous problem. None of this is easy to see. And if you did see it, it might have been as a result not of spotting the forking idea but just of playing with threats and their consequences. You start thinking about pawn from a2 moves to a4, see where the knight goes, imagine taking it once it lands on d4, see that this clears the way for a pawn push to e5, observe that black needs to take the pawn, and then at last come up with the knight fork on e5 at the end. But it's a lot easier to think usefully about these things if you know that you have a potential knight fork lurking on e5 if conditions change. That threat lends structure to the train of thought about your forcing moves and where they lead. Anyway, look at this position also as another study in the art of getting a bothersome pawn out of your way. If you can force an enemy piece to become a protectorate of the pawn, you can then capture the piece and force the pawn to recapture, moving out of the way. White to move. What is the best move? Getting out of your own way. You don't want to overlook a potential fork just because the forking square already is occupied by one of your own pieces. Ask, can the piece that is in the way evacuate the square violently, thus requiring a time-consuming response from your opponent and making the fork possible on your next move? In this first example, white's knight is on a light square and so are black's king and rook. Or just look at the knight's potential moves without being distracted by pieces of your own that already occupy the squares the knight might like to reach. Either way, the point to notice is the potential fork at f6. The trouble is that white's own rook already is on the square. There is standard method for dealing with this. Ask whether the rook can be moved in a way that requires an immediate reply from black, keeping his king and rook where they are. A capture is good for the purpose, and the one possible here is rook takes knight. It calls for black to respond pawn from b7 takes rook, and white then follows up with knight moves to f6, check. Keep track of what you are losing and gaining. Here you have sacrificed a rook for a knight, and are about to win a rook. But then won't you lose your knight after the fork, leaving the sequence awash? No, though that would be true if black could respond to the fork with king moves to f8, for then after knight takes rook black could play king takes knight. But here black can't play king moves to f8 because white has a pawn guarding the square. Black has to play king moves to h8, and then white wins the rook cleanly. When we say that white's initial rook takes knight requires or calls for black to play pawn from b7 takes rook, this should not be taken literally. If black sees the sequence coming, he will respond to rook takes knight by forgetting about his lost knight and instead moving his king to avoid the fork at f6. This is a point common to many of our studies. You have a series of captures that lead to a smashing finale if your opponent recaptures after each of them, but of course he may not recapture, leaving you with lesser gains. In a good game of chess, this often is the importance of seeing tactics. You may or may not actually get to play the fork, but seeing the threat of it allows you to make other gains. White to move. What is the best move? White's knight is on a dark square, so are black's queen and rook. Thus there is a forking square at f3 which is easy to overlook but should be made no less visible to you by the presence on it of white's own queen. You need a move for the queen that forces a response from black, making knight moves to f3 possible. You might first see queen takes knight, but look harder for a check or capture that doesn't require you to sacrifice the queen. Correct is 1. Queen moves to a8, check. 1. King moves to h7 then is forced, knight moves to e8 just loses the knight, and 2. Knight moves to f3 can then follow. White wins the exchange. Most of our forks so far have involved the enemy king as one of the targets, but not this one. When the enemy king is not a party to a fork you are considering, it is important to pause and ask whether either of the forked pieces would be able to break out of it and do damage or seize the initiative with a check. In this case that's not a problem, though, neither black's queen nor his rook has a good option. White to move. What is the best move? A color scan or a look at the white knight's circle of moves turns up a potential fork to be had at e6, and again its potential should not be obscured by the presence of white's queen there. The question is whether the queen can make a move that will force black's response, giving him no time to prevent the fork. Knight moves to e6, check. A move later. First you look for a check, but it turns out that most of the squares from which the queen can attack the king e7, e8, f6, f7, g8, d6 result either in a. the queen being captured by black's king or queen, which ruins the fork, or b. the king simply moving, which likewise ruins the fork. But if you persist you come up with 1. Queen takes rook, check. If 1. Rook takes queen, then 2. Knight moves to e6, check. Forking king and queen, and if not rook takes queen, so much the better. After 1. Black king moves to e7, white can play queen takes rook c7 plus and has still more fun from there. White to move. What is the best move? White's knight is on a dark square. So are black's king, queen, and rook. Knight moves to e6, check. Would be great, but white's queen is in the way. The question, now familiar, is whether the queen can make a move that will force a response from black that costs him a move. You might start by examining, if briefly, any checks the queen can administer, but all of them cause either black's king or queen to move, ruining the fork. So now look for captures the queen can make without giving check. There is just one, queen takes knight. What follows from that? Either pawn from g6 takes queen or rook takes queen, and either way, knight moves to e6, check. Picks up black's queen and wins a knight with the sequence. Incidentally, it may come as a small surprise to you to hear that white's rook on c1 is doing absolutely essential work in this position. Do you see why? It protects f1. If the rook on c1 were gone and f1 thus were unprotected, black would reply to queen takes knight with rook takes queen, aiming his rook at white's back rank, and then after white finishes his knight fork with knight takes queen, black has rook moves to f1, checkmate. Checkmating white's trapped king. The moral: be ever mindful of your own king's vulnerabilities and how any offensive sequences you are planning may unexpectedly expose it to checks, and worse, that are not possible on the board in front of you. White to move. What is the best move? This example combines two recent points we have studied. The initial key is to see the potential knight fork. Knight moves to d5 despite the fact that you already occupy d5 with another piece. The question is how best to vacate the bishop from the forking square. It runs on the light squares and the king is on a dark one, so the bishop won't be able to deliver a check. Is there anything that it might capture? Yes, black's bishop. But before you play bishop takes bishop, notice, as would be obvious in a game, that black is about to play queen takes queen, ruining your fun. So the correct play goes 1. Queen takes queen, rook takes queen, then 2. Bishop takes bishop, pawn from b5 takes bishop, 3. Knight moves to d5, forking the rooks. This position, like the previous one, contains a rook that looks unassuming but that provides crucial support for the whole sequence, the one on f1. Imagine it gone and rethink the position. Now in reply to 3. Knight moves to d5, black moves his rook from e7 to d7, and if white then plays the capture knight takes rook f6, black has rook takes rook d1 plus. In effect black uses his rook to pin the white knight to the white rook on d1. In the actual position white's rook on f1 prevents this because it protects the rook on d1. The general lesson you can draw from this little note is that loose pieces, as the d1 rook would be if the f1 rook were gone, are a hazard. Even if they don't appear to be part of the action, they can find themselves suddenly captured during or after a sequence you are planning elsewhere. Black to move. What is the best move? Unsuitable targets. Sometimes a knight fork is available but only one of the forkable pieces is a good target, the other is a piece of equal or lesser value to your knight, and perhaps is guarded. The question then is whether the bad target can be made a good one through an exchange. We start here with a case where at first glance there might seem to be no forking possibility for black. The point to see is that knight moves to c5 is a potential knight fork even though it won't work now because one of its targets is another knight, so black's knight moves to c5, check, is simply met with knight takes knight. Ask whether you can make your opponent replace the knight with something better by forcing an exchange. Here black gets it done by taking the knight with his rook, 1, rook takes knight, bishop takes rook, and now knight moves to c5, check. Wins the bishop and thus gains 2 pieces for the rook. White to move. What is the best move? White's knight is on a dark square. Black's queen and knight are on dark squares, and also the king, but at the moment it's too far away to fork. So you need to see that white has a potential fork at e4 but that one of the targets is black's knight, which won't do. Ask whether white can take the knight with something else and thus cause it to be exchanged for a suitable target. He can, by playing queen takes knight, check. If black responds king takes queen, white has knight moves to e4, check. Forking king and queen. He ends up gaining a knight. Throwing away your queen to take an enemy knight looks counterintuitive, but a temporary sacrifice of this kind is a common opening thrust in a tactical sequence. White to move. What is the best move? White's knight is on a light square, black's king and knight also are on light squares and can be forked at e7. If you notice the forking idea at all here, in other words, if you aren't lulled into overlooking it because the target on c6 is another knight, you are most of the way home. Of course the knight is an unsuitable target, so you force black to replace it by first taking it with another piece. Thus 1. Queen takes knight, queen takes queen, 2. Knight takes bishop, check. After playing out the fork, white has won 2 pieces. Black to move. What is the best move? Knight takes at d4 looks implausible for black because it loses a knight for a pawn. But the implications of the move change when you see that it is a fork, attacking the knight on e2 and the queen at f5. For then you see the real question is whether white's knight can be replaced with a working target. It can. Black plays 1. Queen takes knight, check. 2. King takes queen, knight takes at d4, check. Winning back the queen with the net gain of a pawn after white recaptures rook takes knight. Like many of these positions, this one can be solved as well by having a look at the consequences of any checks you can give. Black's queen can deliver check in 4 ways. One of them, queen takes knight, moves the king into a new position in which the fork might be seen if it wasn't already. White to move. What is the best move? White's knight is on a light square, as are black's queen and knight. The structure of a fork is there. If the black knight could be replaced with the king, the fork would become playable with knight moves to c5. So ask whether the knight can be taken by any of white's pieces, and see that one of them, the rook, is ready to do the job, and with check. After rook takes knight, check. Black appears to have a choice of recapturing with his queen or king, but on closer inspection the queen is pinned. So the only recapture is king takes rook, and then knight moves to c5, check. Follows. And again the same result can be reached by just experimenting from the outset with the check rook takes knight, check. After the recapture king takes rook, you see black's king and queen in the telltale position for a knight fork. White to move. What is the best move? White's knight is on a dark square, along with black's knight and king. There is a potential fork at f5, but the g3 knight is pinned, f5 is protected by both queen and knight, and anyway the fork is of no use because it ends up trading a knight for a knight. So it's only the barest glimmer of an idea, but when you ask whether you can capture the d4 knight with something else, and what happens then, you find 1. Queen takes knight, check. Queen takes queen, 2. Knight moves to f5, check. A knight fork that wins a piece. Regardless of whether the fork occurred to you at the start, consideration of queen takes knight, check, would have been mandatory because it was one of white's 3 possible checks. We keep emphasizing these separate paths to the solution, i.e., showing how it might have been found by looking at checks and their consequences, because in many positions the idea isn't as clear at the outset as it perhaps has been in these early positions, and in that case starting with a look at your forcing moves is the best way to find tactical ideas. In this case, after imagining queen takes knight, check, and the recapture queen takes queen, you re-evaluate your knight's tactical prospects. You notice that your knight and black's queen and king all would be sitting on dark squares, and the knight would have become unpinned, calling for the fork knight moves to f5, check. White to move. What is the best move? White's knight is on a dark square, so are black's bishop and rook. You see a knight fork at c6. But it won't work because black can respond by moving his rook to e8, both taking it out of harm's way and using it to protect the bishop. As we know, this is a common difficulty when forking 2 pieces, neither of which are the king. One often can move to protect the other. Can you improve the target by capturing one of the pieces and forcing an exchange? Yes, with rook takes bishop, check. To which black replies king takes rook. Then comes knight moves to c6, check. And now white wins the rook. Moving the rook to protect the other piece doesn't work anymore for black because now the other piece is a king. White to move. What is the best move? White's knight is on a dark square. Both of black's rooks and his bishop likewise are on dark squares and are positioned for a fork at d7. Black's queen guards the square but can be eliminated with the simple capture 1. Queen takes queen. Consider black's possible replies to that move. Rook takes queen is out because the rook is pinned. It will have to be 1. King takes queen or 1, bishop takes queen, either of which leaves d7 available for white's knight. Yet this is no good because then knight moves to d7 is met by black with rook takes rook. Again, when you are forking pieces and none of them are a king, you need to ask what damage any of them might be able to do while breaking out of the fork. And anyway, you should not be settling for a fork of a bishop and rook when the king is so close to being on a forking square as well. So after the exchange of queens, white plays 2. Rook takes rook, check. King takes rook, then knight moves to d7, check. Winning a rook with the sequence. White to move. What is the best move? Now combine the current theme with an earlier one. A routine color scan, or a look at your checks, or a look at your knight moves, turns up a potential fork of black's king, good, and knight, no good, to be had by playing knight takes at c6. Can the knight on b4 be exchanged for something better? And what about the fact that the forking square, c6, is guarded? Experiment with exchanges that may clarify the board. 1 pawn from a 4 takes knight leads to 1. Rook takes rook. Now the fork has a better target in the rook, but the forking square still is protected by the second black rook at b6. So it becomes a straightforward problem of attracting away the guardian of the forking square by attacking a piece it protects. Just do another exchange, 2 rook takes rook then allows knight takes at c6, check. White to move. What is the best move? This one takes a little imagination. You might start by seeing the capture you have available, queen takes knight. It doesn't work because black's knight is guarded by its queen. Might you be able to chase away the queen, as with knight moves to c5 or knight moves to f8? No, because the queen just moves to another square from which it guards the knight, example queen moves to e8 or queen moves to d6. But when your own knight is nearby, the thought of a fork always is there, and now such a possibility comes into view. Notice the position of black's king and knight, they are on squares that are poised to be forked. If black's queen were substituted for his knight, white's knight could fork them if it could get to g6. White's knight can't get to g6 from its current perch, but in 2 steps it becomes possible. First comes knight moves to f8, attacking black's queen. The queen moves any place where it still can protect the knight. White plays the exchange too. Queen takes knight, queen takes queen, and now 3. Knight takes at g6, check. Imposes the fork, wins back the queen, and gains white a piece. Another way to think here the reader can judge its utility is to say it's a case where the knight isn't on the right colored square at the start, so it needs to make 2 moves rather than 1, first a move to a dark colored square, to match the one where the king sits, then, after the queen is likewise moved to a dark square, the fork from g6. But notice that this pattern, 2 knight moves, is likely to work only when the knight makes a threat on its first move which keeps the opponent too busy to do anything about the forthcoming fork. In this case the initial move knight moves to f8 threatens black's queen, so his choice of replies is very limited. White to move. What is the best move? Playing defective knight forks. Suppose you spot a potential fork but find that the forking square is defended and there is no way to pin the defender, capture it, or capture anything it protects. It still isn't time to give up. Instead, imagine going ahead with the fork and letting your knight be captured. Picture the board as it then will look, without your knight, and with your opponent's guard moved from its current square onto the forking square. What then would be possible? Consider the consequences of any checks you then would be able to inflict. Consider whether the stage has been set for another fork. Consider whether any pieces that used to be protected now are loose. Consider whether any open lines have been created that would allow you to pin one piece to another. Indeed, sometimes playing fork and letting it fail is more powerful than perfecting it by removing the guard of the forking square. And sometimes you thus will find that an implausible looking fork works after all because the cost to your opponent of taking your knight is too high. All this will be made clear with some examples. In the position to the left, white has the makings of a fork with knight moves to e7, check. But e7 is protected by the black queen. The queen cannot be captured or threatened, and white can't attack anything else the queen protects. So, what if white goes ahead with the fork and black plays queen takes knight? What will the board then look like? 2 things will have changed. The white knight will be off the board and the black queen will have moved from e6 to e7. Both changes are significant. The removal of the knight creates an open line on the c-file, allowing the white queen to attack the rook at c8, and the movement of the black queen removes the rook's protection, leaving it loose. So white then plays queen takes rook, check. And takes a rook for a knight, winning the exchange. White to move. What is the best move? Both white knights are on light squares. So are black's queen and both of his rooks. The knight on d5 has no forking moves, but the knight on d3 has one. Knight takes at e5, forking the queen and both rooks. Is the square protected? Yes, twice. All defenders must be accounted for. Start by worrying about the pawn on d6. It turns out to be a non-issue because it is pinned to its queen by white's rook at g6. That leaves the bishop on g7 to consider. Imagine the board after 1. Knight takes at e5, bishop takes knight. What lines would that exchange open, and what checks would you then have? Just one, rook moves to g8. Examine its consequences and you find that they can be summarized in a word mate. For when you imagine the king fleeing to e7, notice that your d5 knight already attacks the square, and you should be mindful from the beginning of the battery of rooks you have bearing down on the g-file adjacent to the king. You might as easily have seen the idea the other way around. You observe that your battery of rooks on the g-file nearly is ready to mate on g8, but that the bishop on g7 stands in your way. This means the bishop is pinned. We will see many studies like this in the chapters on pins, and is not really defending e5. Since the e5 pawn's other defender also is pinned to its queen, e5 is available to your knight for a possible fork. In any event, if black sees all this as well as you do, and you should assume he will, the actual consequences of the forking move knight takes at e5 still require some thought. If he tries to forfeit only the exchange by just moving his queen and letting go of the rook on f7, black ends up losing more than that, for white can instead take the rook on c4 at no cost. Notice that once white plays knight takes at e5, the c4 rook is attacked twice by white and protected only once by black. So the lesser evil for black in reply to 1. Knight takes at e5 probably is 1. Pawn from d6 takes knight, 2. Rook takes queen, rook takes rook c6 losing his queen and a pawn in return for a knight and a rook. White to move. What is the best move? White's knight is on the same color square as black's king and queen and can fork them at f7. Black protects the square with his rook. If white tries to start by taking out the rook with his queen, black recaptures with his own queen and the fork is spoiled. If white plays queen takes queen, however, black replies with rook takes queen, and now the fork works, winning white a rook. Yet with king and queen positioned like this it would be rash to settle for a rook. Consider what happens if white simply goes ahead with 1. Knight takes at f7, check. And allows his knight to be captured by rook takes knight. Now black's queen is left loose for the taking with queen takes queen, which mates a move later, after black gives a feudal interposition with his rook. So the fork won. Knight takes at f7, check. Works after all, as the lesser evil for black is letting his queen be taken by white's knight, after which black recaptures with his rook, allowing white to then play queen takes rook, check. White ends up with a queen and a rook against black's two knights, an easy win from here. White to move. What is the best move? One knight moves to g6, check. Looks like a promising fork of black's king and rook, impeded only by the knight at e7. One way to handle this, of course, is to capture the knight with one. Rook takes knight, to which black replies one. Bishop takes rook. Now the fork knight moves to g6, check. Wins back the exchange, but the sequence is a wash. So start again, taking a moment to look at what happens if you try for the fork without clearing g6 and just let the knight get taken. Notice especially the battery of two rooks on the 7th rank, which is always a powerful combination. If black replies to knight moves to g6 with knight takes knight, that opens the 7th rank. What checks does white then have? Answer, just one, rook takes rook, which is mate. So black doesn't dare play one. Black knight takes knight, in effect his knight is pinned to the mating square at h7. White's best bet thus is to play one. Knight moves to g6, check. Straight away followed by knight takes knight, as this wins a whole knight for free, a rare case where a knight fork wins a knight. If white instead finishes with knight takes rook, he merely wins the exchange, as black will then be in a position to recapture with his king. It would have moved to g7, whereas if white finishes with knight takes knight, black can't recapture with his rook because his king is in the way. White to move. What is the best move? White's knight and black's queen and rook are on dark squares. White would like to play knight moves to h7 to fork them, but then black's king can capture the knight. So what then? Consider the position that results. When the king or the pieces around it move, it's always wise to begin by checking for any pieces that may have become pinned pieces, in other words, that now find themselves lined up with the king and that can't move without exposing it to attack. Here the king's move to h7 would cause the pawn on g6 to become pinned. As we know from earlier studies, a key consequence of a pin is that the pinned piece can't guard anything because it can't move. In this case the pin of the g6 pawn means the h5 pawn and perhaps more importantly the h5 square are left loose. Perhaps you can take advantage. Carefully examine any check that could be given from there. Think of queen takes at h5, check. The king would have to retreat to g7 or g8. With the rook behind it, the queen then can move in for the kill, queen moves to h7, checkmate. So the original knight fork knight moves to h7 does work, winning the exchange. Black can't afford to play king takes knight, and so must move his queen and let his rook be taken. But it only becomes possible to see this once you imagine what would happen if the fork failed because your knight got taken. White to move. What is the best move? White's more advanced knight has no potential forks except the ineffective knight moves to e6. The less advanced knight at e4, however, is on the same color square as black's king and queen, suggesting a fork at f6. The needed square is protected by black's bishop at g7, and on inspection you see that the bishop cannot be pinned, captured, or lured away by an attack on one of its protectorates. But imagine proceeding with the fork anyway and allowing bishop takes knight. In other words, picture the board with the knight on e4 gone and the black bishop moved to f6. You are especially interested in whether that sacrifice might make an attack on black's king possible, so study its position carefully. Consider any pins that would be in place and any lines that would have been opened by that little exchange. Starting with pins, white's bishop at c4 already pins black's pawn at f7, and still will do so after 1. Knight moves to f6, check. Bishop takes knight. As for open lines, the move of the e4 knight would have opened a path for your queen to g6, where it would be possible for you to give a new check. G6 is loose. This is the significance of the pin we just noted. In reply to 2. Queen takes at g6, check. Black would be able to play bishop moves to g7 or move his king to h8, either way mate follows with queen moves to h7, since h7 is guarded by white's remaining knight. So the original fork at f6 wins at least the queen for a knight, and delivers mate if black is careless.